Hi guys, and welcome to the final lecture of Chapter 8. Now, we've already gone over an introduction to what biodiversity is, some of the benefits of biodiversity, and how we are losing biodiversity around the globe. Now, in the final lecture of Chapter 8, we're going to be talking about ways to remedy some of these issues with biodiversity loss, and this is going to be primarily focused around the topic of conservation biology. Now, conservation biology is a scientific discipline devoted to understanding the factors, forces, and processes that influence the loss, protection, and restoration of global biodiversity. Conservation biodiversity was created as a response to the widespread species extinctions around the globe and the loss in species populations and numbers of different charismatic species that we want to preserve. Now, conservation biology aims to develop solutions to problems associated with species loss, and these are going to be things such as habitat loss, overharvesting, and pollution, things that will all cause species decline if left unchecked. Now, it should be noted that conservation biology is a little bit different from typical scientific norms. In most scientific disciplines, the general objective is to seek out and understand additional and new information about the world around us. However, conservation biology is a goal-oriented science. Basically, it has implicit objectives and values, most of which being the long-term preservation and sustainability of endangered species populations. Now, conservation biology specifically responds to species loss, and typically what this means is it integrates an understanding of both evolution and ecology in order to understand our impacts on different organisms. And conservation biology works across all levels, basically starting at the genetic and organismal ecology and species diversity perspectives all the way up to ecosystem ecology and that ecosystem diversity perspective at the landscape scale. Now, conservation efforts focus specifically on endangered species, and these are species that typically need conservation efforts the most. Endangered species are broadly defined as species whose populations are so low that they are severely threatened with chances of going extinct. Threatened species are also a major concern of conservation efforts, and typically threatened species aren't quite as bad as invasive species, but these are also species whose numbers are swiftly dropping and are quickly approaching numbers that could be threatened with extinction in the near future. So again, threatened species aren't quite as severe as endangered species. Their numbers are a little bit higher, but they are still swiftly dropping, and so they may wind up extinct in the near future if these drops continue to go on. Now, the IUCN Red List stands for the International Union for Conservation of Nature, and this is a red list that documents and monitors species which have a very high risk of extinction. Now, in 2012, 20% of the 64,000 species monitored were threatened with extinction. And it should be pointed out or noted that there are again distinctions between how critically threatened a given species is with extinction. When we talked about threatened species whose numbers and populations weren't quite small enough to be threatened with extinction, but were swiftly approaching that number, we're going to think of as that vulnerable status, that status in yellow on the right-hand side of your page. Statuses of individuals or species that are endangered are going to have the endangered marking, which are going to be in orange on the right-hand side of your page. Now, there is something that is even farther over than endangered, where you're not quite reaching the actual level of extinction, and this is called critically endangered. Critically endangered species have extremely low numbers of individuals in the wild. We're talking less than 100 individuals total, and they may be wiped out with extinction at any given moment. Critically endangered species are typically those prioritized highest by conservation biology. Then we have our extinction categories. Extinct in the wild, that purple category, means that these species are no longer functioning in any wild ecosystem. The only individuals of these species are currently in our local zoos. And then finally, we have extinction. Extinction, that black label, means that these species do not exist anywhere, either in the wild or in any zoos or any captive breeding programs. Now, there is a different side of the IUCN Red List, and those are the organisms and the species that are not currently threatened with extinction. Typically, if a species is doing really well, the IUCN Red List is going to note those species as being least concern or having numbers that are usually pretty sustainable, and that species is doing okay. However, species whose numbers are still doing well but are swiftly dropping are noted as being near threatened, meaning that while their species numbers are okay right now, and if those species maintain those numbers for the future, they would be fine, but because those species numbers are dropping, they're going to be threatened with extinction very soon, if left unchecked. Now, the Endangered Species Act was enacted in 1973, and it is the primary legislation within the United States that protects biodiversity and specifically endangered species. Now, again, it was intended to protect the extinctions of endangered as well as threatened species and allow those populations to recover. And this Endangered Species Act is really powerful in that it also protects the habitats of these endangered species. And this is really important. You can't really protect the species if you don't protect the habitat that it lives in, because most endangered species are endemic, meaning that they've evolved under a very specific number of instances and conditions that make them very reliant on their given habitat and their given ecosystem. When that habitat is destroyed, typically the species that is endangered can no longer be persisting as well. And finally, the Endangered Species Act is important because it also prohibits the trade of endangered species or any products made from endangered species. So it puts a limit on poaching, overharvesting, as well as the illegal pet trade, all of which cause declines in endangered and exotic species. Now, international treaties also promote and protect conservation. CITES, or the Conservation on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Flora and Wild Fauna, is one of those particular treaties. And usually, CITES works by protecting endangered species by banning their international transport of either the organisms themselves for the illegal pet trade or by banning their trade of their body parts. Particularly, their biggest accomplishment is the ban on the ivory trade, which has been thought to do a very great job and go to great lengths to protect endangered elephant species. Now, there are several methods in addition to these different treaties that are aimed at restoring different endangered species. The first of which is called captive breeding. Captive breeding is the process of maintaining plants or animals in controlled environments, such as wildlife reserves, zoos, or other conservation facilities. And this is done with the intention of releasing the bred and juvenile infants or offspring back into the wild to bolster the numbers of wild populations. A very, very specific and well-known case in captive breeding and a very well-known success story comes with the California condor. The California condor is one of the largest birds in the world, and it is essentially a very large vulture. They don't really hurt anyone, they typically feed off carrion, and they're not really considered a problem by any individual. However, they were often killed off for sport, or they were being killed off very frequently because of lead poisoning. Basically, some of the carcasses that they would feed off of would be contaminated with lead due to lead buckshot, and as a result, the California condor's numbers were dropping precipitously. In fact, by 1982, only 22 individuals were remained in the wild. And as a result, scientists made a heartbreaking decision to capture and remove all of these individuals from the wild ecosystems in which they were found and remove them and put them into zoos. Now, what we refer to there within the IUCN Red List is that these species or these individuals were taken from being in a critically endangered perspective and they were removed from the wild, meaning that they were essentially extinct in the wild and then only found in captive breeding programs. However, since 1992, the California condor has made an amazing rebound. Today, captive breeding projects around the world have raised the California condor's numbers from 22 individuals back in 1982 to over 170 individuals at present day. Now, it should be noted that the California condor is still critically endangered. I mean, 170 individuals aren't that many birds, but they're doing a lot better from the 22 that we started with over 30 years ago. Now, there are additional methods to restore species. Remember how we talked about biodiversity being unequally distributed throughout the world? Well, biodiversity hotspots refer to some of those regions. Biodiversity hotspots refer to a region or regions that support especially great numbers of species found nowhere else in the world. These are going to be some of those endemic species that we talked about in Chapter 4. And biodiversity hotspots are important to note because these are areas that we typically like to prioritize because they are very biologically productive and biologically diverse. And as a result, when we prioritize these areas or these critical habitats as those that we want to conserve, we typically conserve a huge number of species, whether we know they are endangered or not, from going extinct simply because we are preserving that habitat in which those species are found. Now, additionally, we can set aside different parts of natural environments as a way to preserve species diversity. And this comes in the form of parks and protected areas. The process of setting aside or preserving natural lands which can aid in protecting species, either whether we know they are endangered or not, from extinction. Now, right around now, 12 to 15% of all of the world's land is currently in parks or protected areas. Now, that's not a lot, but it offers a degree of protection from some of these species that are really hurting in terms of habitat loss and overharvesting. Now, it should be noted that parks and protected areas are not a cure-all. Typically, species in parks and protected areas are typically still hunted and exploited if the parks are underfunded and not properly managed. Still, a protected area does offer some semblance of protection, and so while they definitely can be bolstered in their strength and their protective qualities, they are doing somewhat of a good job at this moment. Finally, ecological restoration refers to the action of restoring degraded ecosystems to a semblance of their former form as well as their former function. Basically, we are taking habitat that was previously degraded and restoring it back to a functional ecosystem. When we talk about this, think back to Chapter 4 when we were talking about our ecosystem or Everglades restoration example, where efforts have been undergone to restore the Everglades ecosystem. When we restore damaged ecosystems, this can often bring back species which are endangered or threatened, as well as reestablish other species that can restore the ecosystem functions of that area, and as well as services by returning different species to their niches. When that happens, and when we fully restore these ecosystems to having a huge amount of function, we create a space for those endangered species to reoccupy their previous niches as well as thrive. Now, this is everything we have for our conservation biology lecture. I hope you've enjoyed both Chapter 8 as well as Module 2. Coming up is going to be your second major exam. Now, study really hard for this major exam. Some of you might have been caught off guard in our first exam, and I don't want that to happen to you guys again for the second exam. Typically, study the PowerPoints, study your quizzes, and really focus on that study guide. Remember that if any of you didn't do well in the essay questions, all of our essay questions are posted in those study guides. So if you memorize all of those different essay questions as well as their answers, you're typically going to be doing very well on that exam. Now, again, if you have any questions about any material from Chapter 8 or Chapter 7 or 6, feel free to email me at any time, and I'm happy to walk you through anything you don't necessarily understand. All right, looking forward to see you guys again in Module 3, talking about Chapter 9.